Canadians in the house. Happy Thanksgiving to you Canadians. Nova Scotia, awesome. Amazing. Calgary, Fort Collins, Colorado. Wowza. India. Wow. Amazing. So cool.
Amazing.
Whidbey Island, Dallas, North Carolina. Vancouver Island, Karen. Awesome. I'm on Vancouver Island now as well. in Victoria. So essentially, the reason why we're here, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we're talking about healing. We're here to talk about healing. And I've been very, very interested in the conversation of healing for a long time. I've been a chiropractor actually for awesome, Cass. I've been a chiropractor for 20 years. And I noticed, why is it that certain people, no problem, they would get better, they would heal, and then others, no matter what we threw at them, they just wouldn't heal. And there was this sense of frustration when it came to certain chronic issues, chronic pain, chronic illness, whether it is an autoimmune, whether it's a digestion, whether it's anxiety, depression. Certain people, simply by adjusting the spine, allowing the nervous system to flow, bringing their nervous system to a sense of safety, they would do great. And then others, nothing that they would ever do, nothing we could ever do could ever really resolve it. And because I have a massive ego, that didn't sit well with me. I wanted to be the person who could actually really help them. I wanted to be, I went into the helping healing profession because I wanted to be more effective. And so that frustrated me. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going just on my own personal development journey. I started researching methodologies of personal growth that were efficacious. Something weird about sending my patients to a medical doctor where I knew that they were going to be drugged didn't sit well with me, or to a psychologist where they were just going to be diagnosed. And so there's something within the medical profession that we all have to know, is that the system, when you're in the system, type in the chat if you can relate to what I'm about to say. When you're dealing with a health crisis and you're going into the system for healing, there's nothing within the system that they can give you that's going to resolve that would warrant you not needing the system anymore. You get what I'm saying? Does this make sense? If I am in the medical system, which is all within the industry, and within this industry, it behooves me to keep you in the same situation. Otherwise, why would I work myself out of a freaking job? Hello, it doesn't work. So I just knew that there was something very, very wrong with this system. And I wanted to really research and find out how to get to the root cause, how to get to the root of it. And when you look at the adverse childhood events.
Hold on, Nima. I think I accidentally muted you.
Unless you make me the co-host, I think you're going to mute me as well every time. So I welcome you to mute everybody, because sometimes people forget. But if you can make me the co-host, then I probably won't. Perfect. Awesome. So you can just keep an eye on everybody and mute whenever necessary. So are you guys getting what I'm saying here? There's nothing within the system. Now, I'm not knocking all doctors. You're bleeding, you're about to, in a car accident, you use the system. But when we're dealing with chronic illness, chronic pain, they'll be the first to tell you, we have no freaking clue what the heck to do, right? Are we all on the same page here? Okay, good. So I'm seeing that, right? So yeah. So essentially what we're dealing with there is, essentially what we're dealing with is a system where we don't have results that deal with actually getting to the root cause. Now, what is the root cause? What is the root cause of most chronic illness? Right? What is the root cause of most chronic illness? Type in the chat what you think it is. Okay. Spiritual, inflammation, stress, emotional, trauma. Right. When you look at the root cause and you look at the adverse childhood events, the ACE study of adverse childhood events, it shows you that almost all chronic illness comes from childhood trauma, adverse events in childhood. Okay, now what happens if you look back? You're a child and you experience injury. Trauma equals injury. Trauma, by the way, is not what happens to you. Please get this. Trauma is not what happens to us. It is what happens when we have a experience of energy in our body, when we experience too much, too fast, too soon, or not enough for a prolonged period of time. The nervous system goes into a fight or flight state. And without the experience of a empathetic witness to discharge that energy gets stored within the body. And oftentimes this energy is stored long before we have the language to explain it.
So Nima, can you kind of go and just kind of describe how that shows up in the body? Like, I mean, even what you witnessed me coming into your program. I mean, how did that show up from your perspective?
100%. So the way that it shows up, well, let me go back, right? Let me go back. And so what'll happen is, if you're a child, especially like in my case, for example, you have an experience. I didn't have we have the big T traumas, physical harm, sexual abuse, that kind of thing. But also we have what's called little T trauma, which is kind of like death by a million paper cuts. If you were told as a child, yeah, you have a girl, we wish we had a boy. The experience of separation. So you leave, your body. Your parent. In my case, my mother left for 3 months when I was 2 years old. I have a 3-year-old son right now. So you can imagine with a little boy, if his mother is gone for 3 months to come from Iran to immigrate to Canada, I didn't really have the language to understand it. So what happens is this alarm starts to show up in the body, and it's so uncomfortable. And we don't have a parent who understands what to do with their emotions to be able to hold space for those emotions. We then end up finding safety outside of ourselves. So what happens is we either dissociate. So we go into a hypervigilant state where we look for safety outside of ourselves. We become people pleasers. We become, okay, mom and dad, it's a shit show at home. So what do I got to do in order to feel safe? Well, I got to abandon myself and look after everybody else's needs. So what that looks like at first is essentially what anxiety sounds like. Hypervigilance, this experience where I need to kind of take care of everybody. I need to take care of everybody else except me, right? Who do I have to be? People pleasing, that kind of thing. And so the way that it shows up in your body is a state of alarm. And so it begins with alarm. So this experience with this sense of unease. So pretty much any disorder that you can think of has this state of alarm in the background. So attention deficit, depression, autoimmune, digestion, the nervous system is not safe. So because of that lack of safety, our fight or flight starts to ramp up and the body starts to go into inflammation. So the inflammation is a result of the trauma. If an area has been extremely inflamed, you have all these emotions and they're stuck in your body because you haven't had a parent being able to sit and be an empathetic witness for you to process these emotions, for you to work them through. Or you were told, Lisa, don't cry or I'll give you something to cry about, and you've been taught to stuff them away, then that energy has to go somewhere. That life force energy gets stored in certain areas. So it could be in your throat, in which case you'll get autoimmune, you'll get thyroid issues. Could be in this area in your stomach. Well, now you got digestive issues. Could be down in your underneath your pubic bone. Well, guess what? You have reproductive disorders. Trauma is inflammation, and every single chronic illness known to man has inflammation at its root. So it's really important to do the smoothies and the changing, getting the gluten out of the diet and making sure you got the fish oils and the probiotics. But what about those attachment traumas? This is what people leave out, and this is where all of my specialty is. And the way that it shows up, Lisa, is a state of alarm and unease. And if allowed to progress, the body then starts to break down. The tissues over a period of time start to break down. Then you go to the doctor, they just look at the surface saying, oh, it's the cells. Here, you have this disorder. Here, take this medication. But they don't actually go underneath to look at, what was your attachment style? What was your attachment style like growing up? Where did you learn to, how did your parents do conflict? Are you holding on to any grief? You know, you were talking about autoimmune. We're talking guilt and shame. You know, autoimmune is the body attacking itself. Well, where are you holding on to guilt and shame? And so this is where we unpack with our students and clients, and we take them through a process where you actually learn how to feel all of the things you've been stuffing away and actually move that energy, which is inflammation, life force energy, trauma that's in the body, and moving it out through the body. Right. So it's important to do the fascial exercises and the smoothies and the gluten and the removal and all of that. And the part that most people leave out, is healing our attachment traumas, the childhood woundings, the inner child, the integration of the shadows that we're holding on to. How do you respond when you feel rejected? So if you can't handle that rejection, well, you're not going to speak up for yourself. And then you're going to hold that in and say yes when you mean no. Well, then you're going to have flare-ups because the body speaks up for you when you don't know how to speak up for yourself.
So Nima, does those, as you're healing in those ways, like, do you just wake up one day and you just like all of a sudden feel healed or better? Or, I mean, what's been your experience with your clients
with healing?
Just with healing, like, what is that? Because a lot of people, like in my experience, so like my expectation of healing is like, I'm just going to wake up and feel better one day. I'm going to be able to do this movement. And it was not like that at all. It was like,
no.
And there was a lot of emotion still attached to it, because now my body feels better, but I've got all this crappy emotions, like these, toxic traits or whatever, like the freeze response we talked about. Like I still have, you still have to deal with that. So what does that look like?
Yeah. What does healing look like? Well, whenever somebody comes in and they say, well, I've been diagnosed with so-and-so, I go, for how long? Well, it's been going on for the last 3 years. The first question I ask, what do you think I asked them? I say, what do you think happened 3 years ago? What happened 3 years ago? Right? Oh, and I wanted to address that as well. So Joanne, this is basically, since Joanne is asking, I'm going to address that. This is not something that I was planning on addressing, but I came into this work basically through understanding what a trauma bond was. And in my last relationship, basically, we were abusive to one another. And essentially what ended up happening was there was abuse happening, and there was an incident that happened where I became abusive. And so in that moment, I had to answer 3 questions. Number one, how did I get into this situation? Type in the chat if you've ever been in a relationship situation where there was kind of like a push-pull dynamic where you were in what's called a trauma bond. Has anyone ever experienced that? A trauma bonded relationship, right? Yeah, you've been in that, but don't tell anyone. Okay, so here's what it was. A trauma bond basically is a push and pull dynamic. Okay, so it's where you have the narcissist and the codependency, and there's a huge we might as well talk about it. There's a huge correlation between chronic illness and codependency. Has anyone here experienced this? Also you're having these chronic illnesses, but then there's codependency. So Lisa, let me take this over and I'll address all of this. Okay. So how is codependency tied in with trauma bonds, with codependency and chronic illness? Here it is. So after that experience that happened, I had to answer, this was several years ago. Number one, how did I end up here in this relationship? How can I make sure that this dynamic has never happened again? Because I had never been abused. I had been married before. It never had happened in my previous relationship where there was any type of abuse, and it hasn't happened since. But in my ex's case, it had happened to every one of her relationships. She's a former sex worker. And what drove the relationship was this kind of coupling that I had with, the sexual thrill with secrecy, silence, and shame. So we had a 4-year on again, off again relationship. And finally, I was ignoring all the signs until it became abusive. And so what ended up happening was I had to answer these questions. How did it happen? How can I make sure this could never happen again? And if I can do number one and number two, how can I make sure that I can now create a secure relationship? And if I can do 1, 2, and 3, then it's my sacred duty to teach people how to actually heal from these trauma bonds. And it's so intimately woven into your health and healing. Normally, if you follow my content, I start with that story. But because I'm answering Lisa and we're talking about health, this wasn't really a topic. And so now that you're asking, so I'll bring it up right now. So essentially, a trauma bond basically starts where there's a narcissistic and a codependent type of dynamic. Where it all begins, it starts in childhood. Has anyone ever experienced being in kind of like a push-pull, narcissistic, codependent type of cycle where you thought you were going crazy? You were basically like, it was affecting your health. You had anxiety, you had depression. Me too, the codependent. He, the narcissist, right. So here's what ends up happening. I'm going to give you the background of it and how that links to your health and healing. Okay. Because it's all about relationships. And Lisa, I'm curious because when you were doing the work with us, we hadn't reached this level of specificity. So it all begins in childhood. Tell me if you can relate to this, where you have the experience where the child is in a is grown up in in an environment where mom and dad have a really toxic relationship. Okay. Where you have a really super duper toxic relationship. One is the narcissist, the other's the codependent. By the way, usually the codependent mother in the father relationship, usually the codependent mother is the narcissistic. Codependent in the relationship becomes the narcissistic mother. And unfortunately creates an environment where you as the child don't feel seen. Type in the chat if you've ever done this, if you've ever experienced that. Okay. The child grows up, it does not feel seen and heard, doesn't feel loved. And so that experience of not feeling seen is traumatic to a child. So they create a solution. And the solution number one is to create a grandiose sense of false self, a false self that is grandiose, the greatest. So this becomes the solution to that trauma, of that childhood trauma of not feeling seen. Let's call that narcissism. Okay, that's narcissism. The other solution to this problem becomes this experience where the child doesn't feel seen. And because that resentment, that anger, that resentment of not feeling seen, you can't take that out on the child, on the parent, because that's going to result in further disconnection. So the answer to this becomes to then turn that anger inward, which then leads to chronic depressive disorders and chronic pain and chronic illness. Let me repeat that again. Solution number one is to direct the anger outward, to create a false self. And now grandiose false self, narcissism, which is one solution to the trauma of not feeling seen. The other solution is to create another false self, which is I'm going to be whoever I need to be to get my needs met, put on a mask, and because it's not going to be worth my while to direct that anger outward on my mother because I wasn't seen or heard, where am I going to direct that anger? Inward towards myself, which becomes codependency, is the next solution. Same wound, two solutions. And what happens is you grow up then with this wound unconsciously, and what happens is you then act it out within your intimate partnerships. And the two are like a freaking magnet to one another. The codependent is looking for the confidence of the grandiosity of the narcissist, who then begins the first stage, which is love bombing. And in that moment where they say, oh my gosh, it's love at first sight, it's not love at first sight. You fell in love with the idealized version of yourself seen through their gaze. Take a moment and pause and just see that. This is really important, because in that moment, because of that lack of self-love, the fear of abandonment from the narcissist completely engulfs and love bombs the codependent. And the codependent surrenders. They have this unconscious polarity. Wow, I feel love for the first time, love at first sight. No, you felt self-love for the first time through his gaze, their gaze. And it works backwards as well, because my ex definitely has some borderline traits. So here we are, we have the narcissist, we have the codependent. On the extremes, we have NPD, because it's a spectrum. On that extreme of codependency, we have borderline, and they're like magnets in a twisted dance trying to resolve this unconscious attachment trauma. And why is this important to chronic illness? Because if you look back on your life story, you will see that the majority of the time that you have these symptoms start to flare up, it's through an attachment trauma. Type in the chat if you can relate to this. Type in the chat if you can relate that when your symptoms first showed up, type in the chat if this is true. When your symptoms first showed up, yes. Or Aaliyah, my invitation for you, if you go on YouTube and you go anatomy of a toxic relationship, I go deep into this. My plan wasn't to actually talk about this. It was to actually address the issue. But since you were asking, I'm going to go into the history. So basically, why is this has to do with work in this case? Sure, an attachment. It's some sort of an attachment wound, Stacy. So what happens is, why this is so important to your health in a healing conversation. Most people will go do the diet, will go do the physical activity, but they won't look at their attachment traumas, right? Where it began, the childhood. They won't look at their attachment traumas, where we first abandoned ourselves. But what happens is, if we don't, we start reliving them within our relational dynamics. So it took that big wake-up call for me to kind of go, whoa, what the fuck just happened? And I went back and I stopped working, and I went and I started really getting digging deep into understanding beyond a cognitive level that I was living with trauma in my body that I had to access through somatic tools. So I stopped working after that incident. I went in and, me and my ex, we were going to work on stuff together. At that time, based on her history, she also is a sex worker working as a madam, supporting other sex workers. Don't ask. I know. I just kind of turned a blind eye, felt it was a good idea at the time. And I said, okay, so let's work on healing this. And she was really keen on us working as a team, as a couple, because of her anxious attachment. And I didn't really want to do it as a couple. I knew this was over. So I took on the healing work myself. And when I pulled away, we both did anger management. We both did all of the work, and I'm actually writing a book about it. It's called Becoming Trigger Proof, A Villain's Journey to Breaking Trauma Bonds and Creating Secure Love. And what I discovered was my own emasculation was the cause of my reactivity. And I had to learn how to really expand the space between stimulus and response. Because yes, I was abusive, but it was reactive. And I was, I could sit here and say, oh, like she did this and that. But the problem was I was messable with. So I became very, very keen on learning how to expand that space between stimulus and response. Because once you get activated, when you get triggered, you then revert back to a childlike state and you're acting as a child. That's why if you've ever been in arguments and you've been in conflict, you've wondered, why is it, right? Why is it that I'm with somebody who is a child, right? So why it's relevant for that is because in that moment, what was just the facts? Yeah, it's just it's the facts, and it's actually.
Nima, I don't know what happened, but I can't hear you. No, I still can't hear you. Because anybody else can hear Nima? Or can people hear me? Yes, you, yes, him, no. Okay. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
And yep, I can hear you now.
Okay, cool. So the reason why I mention of why it's important, I wasn't even planning on talking about this, but okay. The reason why it's important is because in that moment, we had come to an agreement. I had moved on, got married, and I had a child. And then retroactively, what we did was we were actually working on talking about this event with our community. And we were going to actually work as a team to teach people how to overcome this problem, because there's a lot of people out there struggling with the exact same thing. Type in the chat if you've ever been through abuse or violence within a relationship. Nobody wants to talk about it because there is so much shame about it, right? So the reason why I bring it up is because, everything kind of bringing it all out on the table. This is exactly why I wanted to, talk about it and bring it up in terms of taking full responsibility and ownership, and yet talking about it from the perspective that many people aren't able to talk about. And so what ended up happening is after my son was born, I was arrested. And from that moment, I took full ownership, pled guilty, was given a discharge. And ever since then, so this was about 5 years ago, have now been specializing in helping people break free from trauma bonds and take and leave abusive situations. So this is something that now people seek out my care for, because now I have I have like a specialized ability to actually get to that root cause. And so how this is all related to your health is because most health breakdowns happen on the other side of toxic relationship breakdowns. And that's exactly what's happened. So
can I add one thing in here,
sure.
Nima? Yeah. So I just wanted to say that I knew Nima. I was in his program before all that happened. I watched you go through this process. I mean, being in the program and hearing you talk about it all the time. And
it's not something that I hide. It's actually first thing. It's just, today when you said, hey, do you want to talk about chronic illness? I said, sure. So when the person asked, I was like, okay, so let's talk about trauma bonds, because that's usually where I start if you follow my work.
And I just wanted to say that, and I watched you go through that process, and you were the thing that I always respected about you in that process is you were always authentic. You were always very forthcoming with, the way you were feeling and the way, the situation with, with her and all that kind of stuff. And so it was, you were leading not from a, high pedestal point of view that you'd had it all figured out. You were in the shit too. And so I knew Nima before. I knew Nima in the middle of it. And now, I've seen Nima come out of it, and he's happily married. He's got a 3-year-old son, and he's thriving. So it's amazing to see, to be able to witness somebody else do that when you don't have any context otherwise.
Yeah. It was the greatest awakening, because at that time, here was the benefit of this, was that I was living, I had done the cognitive work, helping people heal, but I myself hadn't healed at a somatic base level. And I didn't understand what that meant. But when we would get into our arguments, okay, and this is why I teach about polarity now too, because now it's all about polarity on the other side of a secure relationship. When you get into a conflict, what'll happen is both of your childhood woundings are going to get triggered, and you'll get activated, and then you'll get knocked back into a wound. So now you're dealing with 2 teenagers or 2 little children. And this is where 2 people are arguing. So how are you going to argue? Well, you're going to argue with your one of 4 trauma responses. So I'm going to get you to write this down and see where you fit into this, because this is relevant to your healing journey. You either do a fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. This is back to your health. Okay? So fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. And Lisa, you and I spoke about freeze, right? Yeah. Fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Now, when you get triggered in a relationship, you will either fight, you will run. Fight is poke, flight is run, freeze is deer in headlights. Type in the chat which one you predominate. Or fawn, which is you constantly having to placate, fix, abandon yourself, right? Now this is very relevant, because if we don't learn how to resolve that and lean into self-regulation, we're going to act it out in our relational dynamics. And if you freeze and you don't have an ability to work through those emotions, it's going to come out in your relationships. And most people, especially if you have kind of like a preponderance of the childhood wounding that led to the codependency, which is kind of directing that anger inward, you're going to blame yourself for all of your emotions. And you're going to store them. You're not going to learn how to work through them. And that guilt and that shame accumulates in your body. And that's why with the breakups and the conflict and the attachment trauma, that's where your symptoms start to shoot through the roof. So the answer, other than doing all of the amazing things that you guys are doing in the Health Garage with your nutritional supplements, with your exercise, physical exercises, with taking out the gluten, all of that stuff really necessary. learning the skill of being able to turn the trigger into deeper self-love, and learning how to take conflict and turning it into deeper intimacy. That was the missing piece for me. 5 years ago, when I had that experience with my ex, I was like, I got to figure this shit out. And so when I figured that out, I was like, could I then use that and then have healthy relationships? And yes, I took that pain and I turned it into purpose. And the benefit of actually going through the criminal system was, before that I actually went in and I pled guilty, before that, I wasn't able to speak about this openly. But now that it's done, I can now talk about it. I can teach about it. And we've had an influx of people who've heard my story, messaged me and said, holy shit, I've been so ashamed. I haven't learned how to work through this. My health is crap. I have anxiety. And do you think it's got to do with my reactivity? I'm like, absolutely it does.
Nima, did you have like autoimmune or any of those kind of things show up?
I didn't have autoimmune. The way that it showed up for me was anxiety.
Okay.
Okay. So most of you, that's why if you type in the chat, if you have autoimmune, guaranteed you also are dealing with anxiety as well. Because what that is inflammation, right? Inflammation that's stuck within the body, anger, grief, feelings of shame and guilt. If you're holding on to those because of the events that have happened through relationships in your life, and you haven't learned how to work through them, then all of the smoothies and the physical exercises you do are going to help, but you haven't yet learned how to take that trigger and turn it into deeper self-love. And you haven't learned how to take conflict and turn it into deeper intimacy. So what you'll do is you'll avoid conflict on the outside, which will create the conflict on the inside. Let me say that again. This is the most important piece for autoimmune. Learning how to deal with conflict. Autoimmune issues, digestive issues, is an inability to repair from conflict. Is a rupture. Because we don't have those skills. I mean, where did you learn those skills? Look at your parents. That's where you learned it from. Because you didn't have those skills growing up, because of that, you then, type in the chat, what's your relationship to conflict itself? Right? Yes, Aurelia, there it is. What's your, exactly. So what's your relationship to conflict? Type it in the chat. Can't handle it. Right. So that's the skill, which if we could just keep going upstream, you could take all the supplements, the probiotics, do it. Do the exercises, all the things, do it. But if you haven't learned how to deal with conflict and you avoid external conflict, you're going to create an internal conflict, which pushes that inflammation even further. Does this make sense?
Can I add something in here,
Peacemaker
Nima?
Penny, yes, that's a fawner. Exactly. Go for it. Yes.
So what that point there, just in my personal journey, I had started with Human Garage in January of this last year. And I was, in the mix. I was doing all the things. I was doing the movements. I was doing the organic. I was moving every day. I was going to the beach, all those things. And I was still feeling shit in my body. And it's like, what is it that I'm missing? So like did a scan of all my things. And it was like, I'm not dealing with the conflict and the emotions like you're talking about. And once I put that intention out there, within a week, like it just happened. The people came into place when, like you always said, when the student is ready, the teacher appears, right? And so all these situations and people and conflict came in my life, and I realized I have the opportunity right now to deal with this. And I did. And within the next month, I'm not kidding you, the inflammation, the weight just started melting off my body once I was able to break through that piece that I was dealing with at the moment. Now, there's obviously still more layers in there that I'm working through, but I mean, you can ask anybody here at Human Garage that was around me. Like, it was just like, I wake up one day and like, I see you every day, but you look so different today. Like, it just literally was melting off my body, and I was changing that quickly. So I just wanted to
100%.
add that in there because it was such a cathartic, and just the way I felt my body every day was so different from the day before. And I'd never
Yeah.
experienced that before. I've never experienced healing in that way or at all. So
Yeah.
anyway, I just wanted
Yeah.
to add that in there. And I know you didn't know that part of the story. So
Yeah. Wow. Awesome. So what are the tools for us to work with this? So this is a challenging one because the tools that I use, that I teach, is basically, so when I took a pause from work and I went back into school and I began my somatic experiencing training and trauma work and everything like that. So it's a body-based utilization of inner child and shadow work, which is really about being in those dark feelings and being able to work through them, and with breath work. And so these are the tools that I teach in our Cycle Breakers program, because it's not really like something that you have learned from your parents. These are skills like playing the piano, learning how to, it's not about getting rid of your anger. It's about expanding your capacity to feel it, right? It's not about avoiding your guilt. It's about expanding your capacity to feel the guilt and the shame. If you don't have the capacity to feel the guilt, you'll avoid it. You'll say yes when you mean no, and then you'll turn that guilt that you're avoiding then turns to resentment. Type in the chat if you can relate. You're avoiding the guilt, so you'd rather feel resentment towards the other person instead. Right? And so our work then becomes to heal this, becomes to expand our capacity to be with the discomfort. And the way that I do this in my Cycle Breakers community is we have these group sessions where we work on whatever is triggering us by feeling it fully, by allowing and surrendering to those emotions. I then do a process also called pendulation, where we go into that feeling and then bring ourselves out of it. So you learn how to have the capacity to feel grief. If you want to be a human being, you got to learn how to feel grief, because grief is a part of the human experience. So is anger. So is literally being called out in the middle of a talk, where people are just calling you out in the middle of it, and boom, immediately the nervous system goes into activation. What do you do in that moment? You expand your capacity to feel it, drop into the body, feel it fully, validate the little child inside of you as it comes up. Feel that little child that comes up that feels rejection, that feels not good enough. It all began in childhood. It's all your inner child anyway. Dropping in, right? And then validating that experience, and then boom, returning back to your center. All right. So this is a practice. What are the tools? You can't learn it in a book. This is the problem. You can't learn it by watching a video. You actually have to show up and do the work. Right. So the way that the ideal way to do it is transformative kind of events, number one, group type of trainings where you're showing up to calls like this and showing up and actually participating and engaging. And then the third one is an at-home toolkit where you're learning how to, these neurosensory exercises where you learn how to get out of your freaking head and get into your body. And it's a practice, and it doesn't happen overnight. It's more like building a muscle. What we're doing is rewiring your nervous system, which is used to abandoning yourself as soon as you have a big emotion and avoiding, and rewiring it to lean in so that your prefrontal cortex can send wiring to your amygdala, which is your fight or flight center, and then self-soothe. It's really about connecting with the child inside of you, with the shadows, with the deep, darker parts of yourself that you're ashamed of, and bringing them home and learning how to return back to your center again and again, right? And that's really what the work is. So the tools, it takes time. Those of you who are curious, I wanted to drop in a link if you want to learn what your attachment style is. What I'll do is I'll drop the link here. This is a link for what's called the attachment style assessment. So what that does, it's 10 minutes long. Yeah, it's in the chat. It's 10 minutes long. You fill that out, and then it emails you the results of your attachment style. And what I've done is I give you a free course in changing your relationship with love, with sex, with money. It's all related to your relationship with you. And that kind of takes you through that process. If you're curious and you want to learn more, there it is right in the chat there. And the reason why I do this work is because this trauma that we're living with, it didn't start with you, but it can end with you. Because if we don't do the work, we then are living constantly with guilt and shame, thinking that it's a health issue. It's not really a health issue. Your health is trying to your health problem is not the real problem. The health is why I left chiropractic. The health problem is trying to point you to what the real problem is, which is a abandonment from your younger self. Right? It's an abandonment from your younger self. And it's trying to get you to become more authentic to you, to dissolve the guilt, to dissolve the shame, to learn how to have a secure relationship within yourself. And that's really what it is. And for those that are actually really wanting to learn, I have I'm sure, Lisa, you can drop the link.
Yeah.
The event that I have, it's called the Overview Experience. And it's a 6-hour deep dive. And I teach you how to take your conflict, even if the conflict is against the health issue itself. I've created a methodology called the Overview Method. Even if the health issue, even if your anger is towards the health issue, it's not your autoimmune problem, it's your relationship to it. So if you have resentment towards the illness itself, which most people do, it kind of pushes you further from healing. But what if you saw this health crisis as a wake-up call, which we all have? So for me, my wake-up call was my relationship breakdown. For some of you, that wake-up call will be a relationship breakdown. For others, it will be a financial setback or a work setback. And most people, a lot of people, is a health crisis. So it's not about the health crisis. The health crisis is trying to get you to love you, to reconnect with the you that you separated from long ago, which is where anxiety comes from, which is a separation from self. So consider the possibility that this whole journey is really about, kind of like my wake-up call with my last relationship, is all about finding love and appreciation for the parts of you that you abandoned a long time ago. And when you do, your health transforms, your relationship transforms. I was able to heal from that last relationship and now have an amazing marriage and beautiful son that I was never able to have. And now I'm connected to my why and my purpose. I'm writing a book about it. My friendships have transformed. I feel safe in my own body. And I just want to teach people how to do the same. Yeah. Where do we get the home toolkit? Yeah, this is basically DM me, send me a DM and ask. I'd love to help. If you want to, you go to @Dr. Nima on Instagram. And there's the link for the Overview Experience. If you're really keen on learning, if this is something like, I got to learn, I'm ready to do it. There's those people that I have space for 10 that are coming to the October 21st event. And those that come for the 10 people, they get a free one-to-one with me afterwards. So if they want to talk about their stuff, I have a very intuitive way of and by the way, there's no guilting or shaming. I remember when shit hit the fan with my relationship years ago, and I reached out to people for help, even men, and I was guilted and shamed about it. And I was like, listen, when I get through this, on the other side of that, whoever reaches out to me, I'm going to make sure that they never experience guilt or shame for what they're going through or what they've experienced or what they've done. There'll be none of that. It's just going to be complete understanding and then a path moving forward. So that's really my commitment, right? Yeah, I'm so sorry for my kids. Well, Shelly, here's the thing. Those of you who feel guilt about passing it on to your children, imagine if, you were in your 20s or 30s and your parents all of a sudden began their work and then turned and were able to kind of repair with you. Wouldn't that have made a difference? So even if your kids are 15, 20, it's still not too late. So those of you who are ready to learn, send me a DM and I'd love to help.
So, Nima, there's a chat here that I just wanted to address from Jeannie. So it says, I thought this was about Human Garage, and And it is about Human Garage because I'm part of Human Garage, and this has been my journey. And you might have missed the front part of where I explained why Nima was here, is because I was in Nima's program before I found Human Garage. And one of the biggest things, and he already talked about it, that I learned in his program was the tools, how to regulate my own nervous system, get myself out of the freeze and the fight or flight and all that kind of stuff, and be able to set those stories aside and be able to function and keep my body and my nervous system in a healthy way. And so, and Nima, and I think you and I agree on this, is like, that's kind of the first step in healing, is to be able, because if you're constantly in fight or flight, the hormones are going, and you're in constant alarm.
Yeah.
Like, you can't.
Your number one focus here on your autoimmune journey is to learn how to create safety within your body. When you learn how to create safety within your body, the inflammation naturally starts to go down. You're basically your return to normal state. This is exactly what will happen with you once you learn how to actually, and all of these that's why the exercises are great, especially if you're doing physical activity when you haven't before, because your nervous system goes from fight or flight back to what's called kind of safety. And so that's essentially the most important piece of it. So, that's exactly it. And so when Lisa asked me to come and chat about autoimmune and kind of like the things that where you don't really look under the hood, my number one goal was to teach you about attachment trauma bonds, and how they're actually very integrated with your health.
Yeah. Do you want to take a few questions, Nima?
If anybody has any questions, feel free to send me a DM or an email. I'd be happy to.
That's right, because you have a hard stop here at.
What is the first step course with Nima you use to integrate? The overview experience.
Oh, here, I'll post that again.
Yeah.
And then this information will be sent out with the replay as well. So it'll be linked in your email. But here's the overview link. And then I'm going to do the attachment style one as well. So you have them both right there at the same place.
Yeah, that attachment style survey gives you a course for absolutely free. That link is for those that are ready to actually do the work.
Yeah. So Nima, I really appreciate you stepping in at the last minute.
No problem. Yeah, I wanted to help out, and I wasn't expecting to talk about what we did, but I'm open to. It's not something that I'm very, like, if you follow my YouTube channel or my podcast, it's literally what I start with. So I was just wanting to serve in the conversation of like specifically about autoimmune, but then when the question came up, I just kind of pivoted and then went into my story. So just to make sure that everybody understood, this was not something that it's hidden. It's actually very open and public. So giving you guys lots of love, and thank you for your questions. And for those of you that were triggered, that's okay. My invitation for you is to look inside and see what came up for you and what aspects of yourself were activated. And if you have something you'd like to share, I'm open to the feedback.
All right. So thank you, Nima. I know you have to go, and
yes, I do.
We'll be in touch. And
Take
the
care.
Rest of you, I will.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, Nima. And the rest of you, you'll be expecting the replay in your email in the next 48 hours. So you can watch it as much as you want. You can feel free to share it with people that you might know. If you do have any feedback, questions, those kind of things, you can definitely shoot Nima. He's on Instagram, he's on Facebook, he's, just on all the socials. And if you have questions for me, happy to share, more of my journey in Human Garage. I know that's, a few comments in there about that, but my journey in Human Garage has been, and I can even show, I've shared some, if you go on my Instagram page there, I've got some before and after pictures in there, and kind of the story at the time that I was going through, and just even some of there's one, I think I even posted like the numbers of the percentages I was losing at the time, and all those kind of things. And the other thing is if you're on a healing journey and you're in the app and you're in Human Garage and you're not doing this, I would highly, highly encourage you to do this, because there's some days that you don't want to show up and do movements. You don't want to talk to anybody. You know, you just feel like crap and you don't want to engage, and you feel like you're on day 17 and you feel like you're going to be a quitter if you stop, and all those kind of things of the 20, I'm talking about the 28-day reset. But if you're in Mighty Networks, I highly encourage you to journal in the app, like journal, in the 28-day reset, we encourage you to journal daily, publicly. But by doing that, like, you're expressing those emotions in real time, and you process it like 10x, like you're processing those emotions through your body at such a higher level. And that was my experience in my first 28-day reset. And so I just want to say that because it was really helpful for me. And even on those days I couldn't do the movements and I was detoxing or whatever it was, I was still journaling. I was still going inside and kind of dealing with whatever was coming up on the emotion side. So, and that's what that piece is for. And there's space, there's people there to encourage you, to listen to you, and those kind of things. So anyway, I know it is a few minutes after, and I appreciate you all showing up, and we'll have more of these types of calls. My plan is to continue to bring different guests on from our community, from outside of our community, that I think is very applicable to the self-healing conversation, and what has personally also have been helping me as well. So, and I've got lots of people in different areas that has attributed to my success. So we heal in community, and I am so glad you're here, because that is exactly where you need to be if you're on a healing journey. So, but again, don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have questions or want to know more of some specific things that I've done, or those kind of things. And we've got tons of other testimonials within our in the app, on our on our social media and those kind of things. So, but everybody, you have all a nice evening, and we will catch you on the next one. Thank you.